the things that people said about email were it's going to increase efficiency and productivity. It's going to improve communications and collaboration. It's going to enhance record keeping and organization. Now, those are three things they said email was going to do. What does that sound suspiciously like to you?
Welcome to Women Talk Tech, the podcast for business professionals committed to advancing women in the tech sector.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Women Talk Tech. I'm your host, Marie Wiese, and today we're in the Producers Corner. I'm here with the producers, Elle and Maddie. They're going to introduce themselves in a second. And this is all part of our AI series. And I'm excited because they're going to ask me a bunch of tough questions about AI. And not so much from a technical perspective, but definitely very much from a humanity perspective. And that's what we want to dig into today is AI serving humanity? Or is this just another quick win for the tech world so they can make money on a new technology? I'm going to share some opinions and the team's going to weigh in on their thoughts. So, hello, Maddie and Elle. How are you today?
Hello.
Hello. We're actually in the same room today.
Oh, that's exciting.
Yes.
Which doesn't happen often.
I know.
For the first time, the producers are in the same corner.
We are in the same corner today.
Yes.
All right. But you're not going to be in the corner for long because nobody puts baby in the corner. You'll be out of the corner shortly.
Exactly. So today we are very excited to be talking about responsible AI. And this is going to be the first episode of our AI series where we are going to interview a bunch of guests over the course of the next couple of months and talk about all kinds of topics to do with AI. And like you said, Marie, we're going to be talking today more about the humanity side of things. But once we have our guests on the show, we'll get into the more technical, the more practical, the more business centric. So that's kind of what we have going on today. And we're just really excited to talk to you today, Marie. Elle, anything to add?
No, I think we've been having a lot of internal conversations about this. And I think it's cool and fun now that we get to, have these conversations with our community and our listeners. I know that, Marie, you've been going out and talking about AI, and I think it's an important conversation that we're excited to be a part of and to be having on Women Talk Tech.
Yeah. And I think, so to do with that, I would love to just jump in, Marie, and ask you what you have been seeing over the past 18 months, or really, I guess since the beginning of 2023 was when I think that AI really hit the end user market in a big way. And so what have you kind of seen since that time as you've been going out in the community and just, running Marketing Copilot and getting really involved in the Microsoft community? What have you been seeing?
So I'm going to take it back a little bit further than even 2023. I'm going to go back about 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. And then I'm going to go back even further, another 10 years. So I've been talking about AI on panels. We've been having a lot of conversations about what are the real implications of AI. And it was fine when it was all theoretical and AI hadn't launched itself on the world yet. And, I was doing some of these panels back in 2017, 2018. We were talking about who really wins in the AI race and who actually loses. And there are winners and losers. Let's be really clear on that. There's going to be some very clear winners and some very clear losers. And so it wasn't really until 2023 when it became a reality and everybody and their uncle had access to ChatGPT. And suddenly teachers were realizing that, students were writing essays and papers and submitting them that had been completely put into ChatGPT. And everybody started to ask, is this the future? People don't have to do any work. And I had seen this coming, but being somebody who's been in the tech sector for 30 years, and I'm going to preface this by saying our listeners today, if you're listening and you've only been in the sector for 5-10 years, this is going to sound like a weird story I'm going to tell, but bear with me, stick with me. Because I've been around when people started using cell phones when they were the size of a briefcase. And I'm not really dating myself that much. Lots of people can relate to the briefcase as cell phone. And lots of people can relate to this new thing about 20 years ago, just over 20 years ago, that we had access to called email. And this cool new thing called email was going to revolutionize the way we did business. The things that people said about email were it's going to increase efficiency and productivity. It's going to improve communications and collaboration. It's going to enhance record keeping and organization. Now, those are three things they said email was going to do. What does that sound suspiciously like to you?
Yeah.
What are we seeing from our
I've
friends?
heard those things before.
What are we seeing from our friends at Microsoft about what Copilot AI is going to do for people? What's Copilot going to do? It's going to increase efficiency and productivity. It's going to improve communications and collaboration. It's going to enhance record keeping and organization. So, first of all, we've heard this story before. And the fact of the matter was, email actually turned the workforce in North America, especially, into this frenzied group of activity-driven, tactical-driven people who, because now you could reach me in email and people expected a response within 24 hours, it made us all a hell of a lot busier. And I'm not sure that it improved humanity in very good ways. We had a lot of scamming. We have a lot of spamming. We have a whole bunch of stuff. But I mean, the sheer numbers around what email marketing, as an example, can drive for consumer products. And let's face it, your ID as a human being now is your email address. It's not even your phone number in a lot of cases. It's put your email address in.
That's true.
So we've become an email address. So if we look at that and we say to ourselves, okay, so that's what email did to us 20 years ago. What's the implications of AI? Let's just think about that for a second. What are the implications of AI? Are we suddenly going to be faceless, nameless people now who are mining data in whoever has the biggest data set and the biggest language model that you want to run on? My biggest concern is somebody who's watched. What's the quote? I've seen this movie before and I didn't like the ending.
To throw a little Taylor Swift on
Taylor
the
Swift.
pod.
Let's just quote some Taylor Swift, shall we? I've seen this movie before and I didn't like the ending. And I feel like we're just repeating the same mistakes. We're going to just do it though, at scale, en masse. And so my comment to people is, I think you should really pause. And the interesting thing, as I've been out at these community summits and thinking that my approach and my questioning around some of this stuff is going to get terrible looks, and how could you possibly say that from people in the audience? They seem to be with me. They seem to be on side with this.
Yeah.
And what we're seeing Microsoft partners happen in the channel is they're out talking to their customers about AI and everybody's scared. They're scared. They don't know where to use it, how to use it. Is this going to, change something? The number that Microsoft's quoting, and I think is a really interesting one, is they expect, and I don't know where they manufactured this number from, but they must have manufactured it from somewhere, 37%. AI is expected to improve efficiency by 37% for knowledge workers. So there were similar kind of numbers put out about email. And when I see this number and I think about the average 8-hour workday, if we can still talk about an 8-hour workday, and we take 37% out of that 8-hour workday, you're left with about 3 hours a day. And the question I have for people is, what are you going to do with those 3 hours if this really is the productivity it's driving? Because people say, well, then knowledge workers will be able to spend more time on high value things. Well, that has never been my experience. What it means is, if I can take 3 hours a day out of somebody's work, I can probably get rid of one person. And instead of 3 people doing a job, now 2 people will do it. Because what do companies traditionally do? They see you've got an extra 3 hours a day. They're not saying, okay, well, go back to your desk and think about things for 3 hours. No, they're going to fill it with other work. And as we saw with email, we became busier. And we became busy on a lot of non-productive stuff. And it didn't save us then. My question is, I'm not sure AI is going to save us now. And I'm just asking people at large to think about that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's not that here at Marketing Copilot or Women Talk Tech, we're resistant to AI. Like, by no means are we Luddites who are resistant to technological changes, because being in the technology space means being adaptable and being ready for these advancements. But I think we jump into things so quickly and we don't take a moment to think to ourselves, how can we jump into this? And how can we do this correctly? And I think that's a lot of what we've been talking about. Is it's not that we're telling anyone not to use AI. That would be unproductive in my opinion, but it's how are we using it? And is there room for us to do better this time around?
So in 2023, the tech sector in North America cut 262,682 jobs. They were the first ones to feel the effect of, we don't need this anymore. We don't need these levels anymore. We don't need these people anymore. That worries me. So my first reaction as a human being to AI is I know, machine learning has been upon us for a long time. Machine learning has been around for a long time, and people have done things with machine learning over the years, but now we're putting it out there at scale. And so my question is, what problem are we really trying to solve right now? And what is AI really all about? And there's moments when I go down these rabbit holes and I think it's about greed. So we can build businesses with 3 people who generate the same revenue that 30 used to generate. Is that the community we want to live in? Is that the world we want to live in?
Yeah.
And these are some of the questions I've started to pose as I've been out talking to people, and I've been out speaking with other MVPs in the community. Is people are so excited in the Microsoft channel about how great AI is and all these things that Copilot can do and how you can build stuff in Copilot Studio. And my question is, I know you can do these things, but should we? Is this the path?
Right.
And it's making me worried.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the things that I've heard you say a couple times, Marie, is that we're relying on humans, we're relying on people to do the right thing. And historically, when there's a lot of money on the table, they don't do the right thing. And so you have developed, and you've been, going out and starting to talk about a framework for doing the right thing, for like using AI still. Like Elle said, we're not saying don't use AI. That's not productive. And to be frank, like, it's already out there, so people are going to use it. But it's how do we do that in a responsible way where we're considering, the humanity side of things, the ethical side of things. And I think it's really great to go out, because also it's really easy to say, oh, we have to do the right thing. But then it's like, okay,
but what is the right thing?
What is the right thing? There's so many things that are the right thing, so it's giving a very clear framework.
Some very big names in the industry, and I'm not going to name them, they shall remain nameless, have even questioned, should we have unleashed it on the world? Should we have just started putting it out there and giving it away? And so, to your point, the genie is already out of the bottle. It's not going back in anytime soon. We've put it out there, and it's happening, right? So that's when we at Marketing Copilot kind of put our heads down and said, then let's talk about responsible AI and what a framework for responsible AI would look like. What are some of the considerations and things that we should be thinking about? So, we've come up with these 4 tenets of what responsible AI looks like. There's 4 pillars that we ask people to look at: intellectual property, data security, data and algorithm bias, and brand ethics, and the ethics of how you're going to use it as an organization and how you're going to disclose to people you're going to use it. So I think these are things that every company should have some kind of guidelines or policy in place about this. I've seen people taking entire manuscripts and books and putting it into AI and training it to speak in someone's voice and regurgitate information from something. And while that's all cool, it's not giving credit to the creators. It's not giving credit to the people who tirelessly created that content in the first place and put it into a tool that perhaps then they're going to start generating revenue from. I mean, we've talked about things like Dolly. Everybody thinks Dolly is so cool because you can put in a couple of prompts and get a painting, spewed out at you that is in the style of Gustav Klimt. Well, there's not going to be very many Gustav Klimts around anymore, because who would want to create original art if it can continually be ripped off in a tool? And I think that's where not enough people are asking that question. We've kind of dug into some structure around each one of those tenets. I don't know if you want to dig into them individually or talk about them, but here's the quote though that I want to share right now, and I'll probably come back and reference it at the end. We're smart enough to invent AI, dumb enough to need it, and still so stupid we can't figure out if we did the right thing. That's a quote from Jerry Seinfeld at the Duke commencement address in 2024. And I just think it's so bang on. We're smart enough to invent it, dumb enough to need it, and still so stupid we can't figure out if we did the right thing. And that's really the question I'm posing. Did we do the right thing? And how can we at least create a bit of a framework around protecting our organizations, protecting ourselves as people, and what does that look like?
Yeah. I think, starting off with that first pillar of intellectual property, when we get advancements coming about so quickly, do we have the time? Is policy keeping up with how fast these advancements are coming out? So with intellectual property, we have these questions of where does your content come from? Who created it? Who is getting the credit and the royalties for this creation? And unfortunately, there hasn't been enough time to, if you think about how long legislation takes to pass, realistically, there has not been enough time to create something of a legal framework, and nor would there ever be a universal legal framework that could protect that? So, it's kind of on the individual to consider questions of intellectual property and credit. And, I just graduated university, and this was a major conversation. What does it mean to be academically, what does it mean to hold academic integrity in an age of AI? And what does it mean to, cite an AI source? Because when you're citing an AI source, you're actually citing thousands of data sets at the same time, because it's scraping from so many different places. So this is a very key consideration, I think, especially in all aspects of the workforce, but also in the creative fields, of writing and art and those things.
Well, and I spoke to a data scientist recently from Microsoft who was trying to school me on how a large language model works. It's just all of this data that's dumped, and there's no cleansing it for bias, as an example. There's no cleansing it for copyright. There's no cleansing it. Now, even though companies have claimed, and the US government is demanding that some of the big technology providers police things like copyright, there's no attribution to this content that they're generating. So, I take content from this large language model and I generate something. Who gets the credit? Is it the AI end user who generated the content? Is it the developer who created the AI tool? Is it the human whose work was used to train AI? And I think not enough people are stopping to think about that. And we like to talk about consent, compensation, and credit. We want consent if you're going to use somebody's work, compensation if you're going to make money off it, and credit where credit rightfully is due. And, it's a sad fact of the matter. Human beings like to cheat. Human beings, if they can find a shortcut, will find a shortcut. Who actually likes to do the work? Not a lot of people put their hand up and say, I really want to do the work. And so, this is where I think you're going to get into some really uncomfortable, ugly scenarios.
Yeah.
And so, I know that you have some other best practices. I mean, we talked about the 3 C's of content creation, which as a big part of Elle and I's job of what we do is a lot of content creation and always making sure that we follow the consent, compensation, and credit. Do you have other best practices for businesses when it comes to intellectual property?
I think, what we've talked about, because we have a policy at Marketing Copilot, we're very transparent where we use AI tools if we might want to brainstorm, do some research, do a little fact finding. But when it comes to actually writing stuff, we want to leave that to human beings. And we think organizations should do the same thing. We think that organizations should inform clients and employees of where, when, and how generative AI is being used. We have a document now that, Elle, you were really helpful in putting together about where AI gets used in our business and where it doesn't. So I wouldn't be very happy as a customer if I was hiring somebody to generate really valuable content in their content marketing program to find out that they're just running it through ChatGPT. I wouldn't pay for that.
Right.
And it wouldn't last very long. And we've even had clients who've tried to generate blog posts with chat themselves because they said, look how easy this is. And then they generated something, posted it, got terrible engagement. It wasn't on brand. It didn't have anything meaningful behind it. And there was still a ton of work involved in doing it. Just because you generated the content doesn't mean it automatically populates itself on your website and gets shared in your LinkedIn network. And so our customer that I'm referencing did it once and then said, this isn't very good. And there's still a hell of a lot of work here. Maybe you are useful. So, this is, I think there's a lot of testing going on in marketing right now. I think marketing's an obvious place to go. There's a bit of low hanging fruit there. But I don't know that it's great. And I think, you should definitely decide where it plays a role and be honest about it. The other thing I know we do at Marketing Copilot that's so important is finding original sources. Maddie, I know you've been responsible for a couple of guides for clients, and you've had to hunt and pack your way into the bowels of the internet to find, the data source, right? And even then you were like, where did this come from? Because this is not right. And not a lot of people.
That happens a lot.
But not a lot of people are going to do that, right? They're not going to do that.
Yeah.
And I think you need to proactively look for content that's derivative or infringing on your IP, your portfolio, your trademarks, your copyrights. It's a very sensitive subject at Marketing Copilot. And I think there's a lot of companies that are going to feel the same way. Where I do think, and one of the places, and I don't know what your thoughts are on this, but one of the places where I think AI, if it's implemented correctly, could really, really be valuable is searching content that exists within a company, within an organization. So imagine, we've had a client for 6 or 7 years. We've been publishing content for them for 6 or 7 years. There might be photos associated with that. Imagine being able to source it and say, here's the proposal we put out 6 years ago, or here's, it brings it back, and it's not just a search function. It brings back what you're trying to create based on past content. And I think that's very cool. But there's a real special way to implement that. And that's where you need your technology provider looking over your shoulder, because you don't want it accessing all information. And you want to be careful who's using it and how they're using it. So I think our clients, the MSP community, the Microsoft partner community, this is what they're being very careful about. They're treading very carefully.
Yeah.
The good ones anyways.
The good ones. And that brings us really nicely, I think, to the second pillar of the framework, which is data security. And this is really asking the question of like, just because tools like Copilot or other, AI tools are out there doesn't mean that your company or your organization is necessarily ready to implement. So it's really looking at your data security posture, your cybersecurity posture, and wondering, are things in the right location where if you add AI to that, it's not going to be grabbing the wrong information, giving the wrong people access to the wrong information. So Marie, do you have anything to add to that or best practices that you can offer to organizations?
Well,
on that front?
One of the things that Microsoft is not talking about, which is very interesting. And when I think back to my example of email from 20 years ago, the other promise of email was it was going to make it cheaper to do business, and the cost of entry for early stage companies wouldn't be as high as big companies who've had to go out and build infrastructure, because the more people you have involved, the more complex it is. And all of that's kind of been blown out of the water by what we've seen with cyber attacks and a whole bunch of things, that technology is costing more and more money annually to run. We're a small business, and we probably spend over $3,000 a month on technology and services and security. And we never spent that before, ever. So it's costing more and more money, because keeping on top of these things is getting harder and harder. And having a trusted partner who can make sure that your data is secure and locked down is really, really important. If you're trying to do this stuff yourself, it's really hard. So it's costing more money. Even though we have things like multi-factor authentication, we've all been exposed to that. Being able to tell, when we're trying to share logins for stuff, we all get bitten in the butt by that, don't we? Which is the way it should be. But, how we collect and use data. These things are really important. I think one of the other things that a lot of our partners have been doing is helping people conduct regular security audits and continuous monitoring. Again, There's some fantastic tools out there. But if you don't know how to use it and you don't have the right people in place helping you deploy this, it gets really dangerous. One of the things I saw as a best practice that I love is to train your employees on data security best practices. So don't just make that the function of the IT department. Bring everyone into this conversation and explain, when you're out with the company laptop and you log on to Wi-Fi, here's what's happening. This is why this is locked down the way it is. But even for small business people, we need to really educate ourselves on some of these things. And, the gap that used to exist between the sales and marketing people and the IT department is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And suddenly sales and marketing have to be in IT, and IT has to be in sales and marketing. So these are all things we need to know as human beings.
Yeah. And I think, that leads us into integrating AI, en masse within our companies. And, how does that align with our brand and our ethics and the way we do functions? And you had mentioned that I put together an AI map. And I was watching a webinar the other day, and they recommended that every company puts together a map of where you're using AI in your process, and that everyone in your company is aware of how to use AI during those processes. We talked about this, but you can't just randomly prompt a large language model. There's ways to do it. And even though AI is making it so easy to automate tasks and generate content, does that mean that we should be doing these tasks that we don't want to do or we don't believe in just because now they're easier? And I don't know, I wonder if you have any thoughts on how to remain true to what your brand does and what your company stands for now that we have these new tools that can do the things that we don't really love for us. And, maybe we feel pressure to do them now that there is more, accessible ways to get them done.
It's a tough question because, for us, the business we're in and the work that we do, we know there's a lot of garbage out there in the world, right? There's a lot of garbage content And we're seeing engagement rates go way down, and we're seeing more and more information getting flooded. And it's hard. It's hard as a buyer. Let's just put ourselves in the shoes of a buyer. I'm a buyer, whether I'm, not so much buying something personally. I think consumer goods have sort of got a bit of that figured out, although they're, e-commerce is still in huge transition. But let's say I'm a business owner and I'm trying to figure out how to upgrade my ERP system, as an example. And I can go online and start to look at products. I can start to figure out what's it going to cost for an organization my size to upgrade the ERP. I'm probably at some point going to want to go talk to a few people about, how do you approach it? Where are the gotchas? How should I think about it? And I'm sure there's information out there about this stuff. But what we, definitely prompt our clients to do is put information out there that's true to who you are as a business, true to who you are as the way you help customers. And if you want to take shortcuts and just blindly push bad content out there because you generated it in ChatGPT, then your brand is going to take a hit for that, and your customers are going to take a hit for that, whether you like it or not, right? I think you have to stay true to who you're helping, how you're helping them, and that requires work and heavy lifting. And AI is not going to magically track my pipeline or do a whole bunch of stuff. It might help me a little bit with reporting, but a human being still has to be creating that relationship in order to put the right information into the data model in the first place. And we all know, as human beings, we don't all start in the same place, right? We don't all fundamentally start in the same place. It's a little bit like coming to the party and you might be in kindergarten, don't know how to read yet, or you might have just graduated from high school and you're about to go figure out what you're going to do for a living. Those are very different places you're starting. And the same thing holds true from the information that we're putting in and how we're using it to help people.
Yeah. And I think paying attention to who on your team, has an aptitude for AI and who on your team is interested in it as well. Because, when your employees want to do something and want to learn something, the output is going to be so much greater and so much better as well. Because when there's passion behind something, I think that's when you get better content being created, better relationships being created. But you're right. Not everyone starts in the same place. And I think that leads us into our fourth point.
Yeah, very nicely into our fourth point, which is all about data bias and algorithm bias. And, I think there's a lot of questions floating around about is it possible to truly make unbiased algorithms? Personally, my belief is no.
I would also say no.
I would also say no.
It's about asking.
You're not going to get an argument from me on that one.
Yeah.
3 no's from the Women Talk Tech team.
But it's about really looking at the fact that AI is, pulling from data that already exists, and it's pulling things from the real world, and the real world is not an unbiased place to live. And we do start out at different spots in life. And it's about asking, what biases were in place, creating certain pieces of content, and who's being harmed and who's being left out by algorithmic bias.
Well, here's a perfect example. And a lot of banks have started to use AI in how they model products and services for their customers based on data. And, this statistic absolutely blew me away. So first of all, the Black community in North America has not, in the 60s, they weren't allowed to buy property. They weren't allowed to get a mortgage. They weren't allowed to have certain types of access to certain types of financial products that the white community had. So that was only since the 1960s. So we've started collecting data in the first sort of iteration of the machine. And here's this community who definitely did not start in the same place that the rest of the community in North America did it. So even into the 70s now, it's collecting data on mortgages and financial products, and it's collecting all this information. I could also say that women are another subset of that who got really badly left out. We weren't even allowed to vote up until a certain time, and we really got left out. But that was before I think machines started collecting a lot of information. So now we're into the 70s and 80s when machines are starting to collect data. And now we're starting to run these AI tools against these data sets to create products. Well, whose information is conspicuously absent from that information? And
also, may I just say that, even though there was times before these machines were collecting data, a lot of these data sets have been uploaded from pre-machine learning and then still used to train. So it's like that biased information still exists. It's still been digitized and it's still being used.
And this was a conversation I had with this gentleman at one of the AI summits. And he came up to me after I talked about the example we experienced on LinkedIn with the machine taking down something because it didn't want to talk to a human being and find out whether or not it was appropriate to be taking it down. And he said, well, do you understand how these large language models work? We can't get the biased information out of it. It's just pulling all of this data. And I just looked at him and I said, but isn't that wrong? Didn't you start in the wrong spot then? Because now all you're going to do is perpetuate this. And so even though he was explaining to me how it worked and I understood how it worked, doesn't make it right. And this is where I'm concerned because we're now going to start to build, we've definitely seen this in the consumer world, but we're going to start to build products and services for people, and not everybody's at the table being represented in the information and then in the data. And that's where I think it's going to be very problematic very quickly.
Yeah. And it is so important to have, I think on this podcast, we always talk about having a seat at the table. And oftentimes we're talking about, women having a seat at the tech table or gender minorities having a seat at the tech table. But here we're talking about, not just from like a gender or a racial background, but we're talking about, making sure that technologists are there, obviously developers, but also humanists and people who are focused on humanity, people who are looking at sociology, who are looking at anthropology, who are like looking at all of these like social sciences and the human side of things, have just as valuable of an input to add to the conversation about AI as developers and technologists do. And I think that's a really key part of this whole conversation around bias.
The technology sector as a whole has had a bad habit for many years, and I've watched it. I've experienced it myself in many software companies that we build for people. We come up with an idea and we say, oh, wouldn't it be cool if we could use technology to do A, B, and C? Oh, that'd be really cool. And then we build it. And I know this for a fact because most of my career in marketing has been spent getting handed a product and said, figure out how to market this. Instead of saying, what's the problem that exists and how do we want to close the gap with a technology product? We get handed it after the fact and say, find out who could use this and who will pay for this. And I've said for years that that's wrong. It's broken. You can't do that. And so the expression I've heard recently that I think is brilliant, and I really, really, really hope that more people will take this to heart, is built with, not built for. If you're sitting in a room coming up with something and saying, I'm going to build this and then throw it over the wall and see who wants it, instead of putting everybody at the table and say, well, what problem are we really trying to solve and how are we going to solve it? That's building with, not building for. And I really, really hope as we move forward in the next era of AI that we sit down and do that.
Yeah. And I think also in this next era, as Maddie said, it's important to also turn to these thought leaders who are coming out with really important information about, how to use AI and also how AI has been used harmfully. I studied that a lot in the last 2 years of my degree. I fully shifted my focus to kind of AI and technology because it felt like imperative. And I think it's important that we listen to each other now. You know, we sit down face to face as well and have these conversations. And, you know, that's why we're here doing this, because we know that women and gender minorities get left out of these conversations. They always have, and they will continue to. Yeah. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Maddie.
Well, I do just want to shout out, and we'll also put this in the show notes, but one of the big kind of inspirations for us developing this particular pillar came from an episode of Unlocking Us, which is Brene Brown's podcast, where she interviews Dr. S. Craig Watkins. So we'll link that down below, but he's one of, I think, the voices to watch right now and to really listen to when we're talking about humanists and technologists coming together to really address these kinds of issues.
Yeah, I think we can also put a couple resources in the show notes, because I know that I definitely have a couple that have been really influential in like helping me decide how I want to use AI and, you know, both my personal and professional life. And I think sharing those resources is also something we want to do with this series.
I think that's also a really important point to raise too, is like your organization that you work for can have a policy about AI, but I think that you should also have your own sort of, I think like us as individuals should take a minute to think about our own individual sort of policies about AI and what we think is right and what we don't think is right, and question whether or not that aligns with your organization, and also question whether or not your organization even has a policy around AI or something that they're even being open about, because if they're not, that's also something to really interrogate as well.
Yeah. And I think it's also not being afraid to, you know, talk to people in your organization.
Yeah.
You know, like we've been asking each other very candid questions about AI and how we've been using it and how we want to use it. And I think that's probably something that we as producers are excited for this series, is to hear how other organizations and other people are really taking AI and what they're making of it. And I was wondering, Marie, if you had any hopes for this series, for anything you were looking forward to.
Well, I very much would love to hear people's thoughts about how we're repurposing other people's work, how we're thinking about our own brand ethics, how we're protecting trademark. In my opinion, AI has blown open the can of worms on what we call trademark. What's the point of owning a trademark and having a trademark if it can be simply and easily used by somebody else with no repercussions? And I watched a movie this week that I know it's been out for a while and I haven't seen it. It's called Lady in Gold, and it has to do with, and I referenced it earlier, that's why I used the Gustav Klimt example of a painting. It had to do with a very famous painting that had been stolen from a Jewish family during the Second World War. It had been hanging on the museum walls of a museum in Vienna, and the woman who had owned it rightfully wanted it back because it had been taken away. And it was, as had all of the family heirlooms. And, you know, I think about that story and I think about the idea of theft. And that painting had been commissioned by her family of one of her relatives, and it was her aunt in the painting. It wasn't like it was just some anonymous piece of art that somebody had purchased. It had been commissioned. And when we think about it, you know, how often that particular painting, Lady in Gold, is used and referenced. And here's this piece of art hanging in a gallery when they didn't have permission to put it there because somebody stole it. So I think about those things because I think AI is doing the same thing. And I think we're stealing people's work. We're stealing people's hard thought through as human beings. They thought through something. They tried to put structure around it. They tried to test it. They tried to, you know, see what played. There's a lot of artists who never made any money when they were alive, but their paintings are worth millions and millions of dollars now. And I see some of this going on. And so I hope as human beings, we will ethically, as you pointed out for ourselves, say, what's the right thing to do when we go to create? How do we celebrate and acknowledge those who came before us? And just because we can go use AI to do something, should we? And I hope those are the questions that our audience is asking. And I hope it's the question that people at large start asking. we might end up being a voice in the wilderness on this because there's a lot of people rushing to make a lot of money off AI right now. But my question for our listeners, and I hope they take it back to their companies and their organizations and ask the question, is this the right thing to do? Because as human beings, we can do better this time around. I am absolutely certain of it. And as I said, my career has been long and sometimes very tedious in the tech sector. We always seem to be turning to something new. And just because we can do it doesn't necessarily mean we should.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's a great way to kind of wrap this up and move into, the episodes that are forthcoming. And a good question to keep in mind while our listeners listen to this series and while we produce it and create it and host it. And thanks for sitting down with us today, Marie. We always love our Producer's Corner episodes. I know I do.
I do.
So we love it. Sit down and chat.
Thank you. Yeah. And thank you for the work you're doing on this podcast. It's really important. So I'm going to be on the road for the next couple of months talking to people, particularly on the topic of AI. And the keynote I'm giving is responsible AI. We can do better this time around. And so I've already been pleasantly surprised at the response I've gotten from people in the community who agree and that we need to raise the voice here. On the other hand, as we've discussed, the genie's out of the bottle. It's not going back in anytime soon. So, if I could rewind back to the launch of email and I would have put my hand up and said, so what happens when people start scamming people with email? I wish I could have put my hand up around that. I wish I could have said, so cool tool, but what happens when? So I want to do better this time as a human being. I want to ask the question, what happens when?
Yeah, I think it's a great question to ask. And we'll also put information in the show notes about the places that you'll be speaking at. And if any of our listeners are in the area or will be at any of those conferences or events, then you can come say hi to Marie.
I feel like I'm advertising your world tour right now.
Yeah.
Well, we've got a lot of really good guests coming on this season and on the show, and we're really going to dig into the AI topic. So I hope everybody stays with us for this season and these episodes. Very important discussion.
Yeah. Sounds good. Wonderful. Well, we will see you when you listen to these episodes, I guess.
Yeah. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Women Talk Tech.